Hello everyone, this is part 2 of our Introduction to Chemical Kinetics. I listened to the video from part 1 going with all the graphs and everything. I'm not sure that was really the greatest recording. I can always redo it if it doesn't make sense, but it's probably fine, especially if you look at your book. So I'm just going to kind of blast through. This is sort of a mental checklist for you, a little bit of overlap between the presentations, just to make sure you understand the basics of chemical kinetics from the first part. So remember that a reaction rate is like a differential in calculus, if you've had calculus, like a dx dt. So it's a change in concentration or a delta concentration over a change in time, delta t, change in time. And we can use a lot of different ways to measure amounts. Typically, we're going to use molarity, and that's fine. So be able to understand that what a reaction rate is. And we have a few different ways of measuring it. If you take a specific time interval, like between 2 and 4 hours, okay, so you just calculate the rate. Concentration from time 4 minus the concentration at time 2 divided by 4 minus 2. And that would be an average rate over a specific time interval. That's probably the most straightforward way to think about it, because you can just do a slope, change in y over a change in x. The instantaneous rate will be a little bit more difficult. You would have to take the tangent of a specific point on the curve and then calculate the slope there, which you could easily do using something like Excel or a graphing program. Very simple. But we're just going to stick with easy stuff because we're just trying to make the point. And then the initial rate. Typically the fastest is at time 0, so it's the tangent. It's the instantaneous rate at time 0, and we just give it a special name called the initial rate. Fine. And then that generic chemical reaction I gave you, A moles of A, B moles of B. So that's a way you can relate rates through the coefficients. So all the rates of reactants and products are tied to each other. The reactants, you use a negative sign because it's being consumed, so the concentration goes down, but you multiply by a negative to report the rate always as positive. And then for products, well, they are increasing over time, so those rates will naturally be positive. So I think maybe I confused things a little bit in the previous one. Okay, so what we're going to do here is this is part 2, and part 1 was really the practical side of chemical kinetics. Part 2, which is not till the end of chapter 12, but you probably figured out by now, I kind of like to give you an overview of a whole topic and then cycle back and go through the specifics. So that's what we're doing here. So I think what I'm going to do is just give you a little bit of time to copy this slide down, and then I'll put some additional information on the next few. So theoretical kinetics. So what's going on a molecular level? And you'll find that a lot of this language is exactly the same as collision theory or kinetic molecular theory from gases. That things have to collide in order for them to react. It kind of makes sense that molecule A actually has to hit molecule B or come into contact with molecule B in order for a chemical reaction to happen. All right, that's fine. And I think we can probably go through this fairly quickly. And you can stop the video and take those down if you want to. So rate is proportional to the number of collisions per unit time. Well, that maybe makes sense. So if I increase the surface area of the chemical reaction, I don't know, by pulverizing a solid, making it from big particles into small, it's going to react more quickly. If I increase the concentration, they're going to collide more often. If I increase the temperature, that increases the kinetic energy and more collisions. Increase the pressure. But those are all ways that you can increase or change. Doesn't have to always be increasing the rate. And you actually have to collide in the proper three-dimensional orientation or position. Because what's a chemical reaction? Well, you're breaking bonds and making bonds. All right, so you have to actually collide in the proper three-dimensional position. That's perhaps most easily understood in biochemistry with things like enzymes and proteins, like the lock and key model, where it has to fit perfectly in order to react. And the proper energy has to happen. That's called activation energy. And I'm going to show you a graph for that later. So the EA is, in order for that to, what's often called a thermodynamic barrier. So that's sometimes I'll just write that there. A thermodynamic hill, a thermodynamic barrier that has to be overcome in order for a chemical reaction to occur. So this is just the text, and I'll give you some graphics to illustrate this here in a little bit. The next thing, and I have an example for hydrogen peroxide decomposition. Chemical reactions are not always one and done. Like it's one step and it's over. Often they are. Often they are. When you take organic chemistry, those of you moving on to that, you're going to get into this much more detail, in a much more detailed fashion, is what is the mechanism, the steps, the sequence that a reaction goes through to go from point A to point B. Fine. So I'm going to show you an example for hydrogen peroxide that actually occurs in the decomposition that occurs in 3 steps. That's just an example. Not every chemical reaction is 3 steps. Some are 1, some are 2, some are more than 3, but usually not more than, well, 3 or 4. I don't think there's many more than that. It's usually pretty simple. And the steps are called elementary steps, and you add up the steps and get the overall. It's kind of like, what was that from first semester? Hess's law, where you could add up a bunch of chemical reactions to get an overall one. It's analogous to that. It's not the same thing, but it's, if you want to kind of think about it, a little bit. All right, so every step requires a certain amount of activation energy. That kind of makes sense for it to occur. All the steps don't occur at the same rate. And the overall rate, this is a really important point, the overall rate of a reaction is determined by its slowest step. It's kind of like, I don't know, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. That's kind of a dumb way of putting it. But the slowest step is called the rate determining step, because that's the one that if you want to say, well, how fast is this reaction? Well, it's only as fast as its slowest step. Okay, the rate determining step. Well, RDS is an abbreviation that we'll probably use. Oh, there it is. I forgot I wrote that there. I guess I was thinking ahead. And catalysts. Catalysts are something, kind of the word says it. It catalyzes the reaction. It speeds it up. How does it do that? An enzyme, if I knew more biochemistry, I would teach more biochemistry. An enzyme is a biological catalyst. So something in either plants or animals or just in the natural world, so biological. And what they do in order to increase the rate, they lower the activation energy. They lower this thermodynamic barrier. That's how they speed things up. They're amazing. Enzymes in your body, if you didn't have enzymes, your metabolism wouldn't function. The reactions would not occur anywhere. And what enzymes really do in your body is hold large biological molecules in the proper orientation so that they can react. And without them, it just, well, the reactions would be so slow, life wouldn't occur. So enzymes are there. Okay, so I think I left these here before. Yeah, so the example we're using is, and I was really tired when I made that last video. So hydrogen peroxide is a defense mechanism both in animals and plants. So tomato plants, lots of plants. Like so an insect or something bites into the leaves. Well, one of the things it can do is to use hydrogen peroxide as a deterrent. And your white blood cells, I think I wrote white bloods or something on the last one. So these are white blood cells, use hydrogen peroxide to kill invading cells. Fine. All right, let's look at a specific example, the decomposition of hydrogen peroxide to make the point. I'll give you a second there. Oh yeah, so this is just a case study. When we think about mechanisms, hydrogen peroxide takes place in aqueous solutions. We have aqueous H2O2 going to liquid water and gaseous oxygen. It's easier to think about theoretical kinetics in homogeneous settings. So it doesn't really matter for this one, but just so you know that we're thinking about here, everything in the gas phase. So a homogeneous reaction rather than a heterogeneous one with different phases, solids, liquids, and gases. For this, it doesn't really matter. So, there are 3 steps to this, and what I'm going to do is I'll have the text description on the left, and I'll sketch out some notes on the right, and there's just kind of a bad joke here at the end with an image. What some of you may be familiar with H2O2. It's just a bad joke. So step 1. And I guess I can do this side by side. This will be a little bit more efficient. So the O-O bond in hydrogen peroxide breaks in half. Well, it splits down the middle. Okay, so what ends up happening is, I'm just going to streamline this. Here's the electron dot structure for hydrogen peroxide. This is a fairly unstable bond here in the middle. Pretty weak bond. It will break in half. And what you end up getting, I'm going to exaggerate that one, is, well, the molecule is split exactly in half. And that lone single electron right here is what's called a free radical. When it's an unpaired electron, so you may want to add to your notes here. So a free radical is where you have a lone electron, so a single electron. That's a very reactive species, and this happens twice. That's the first step. And this is the rate determining step, actually. This is the one that's slow. It might make sense because these are really reactive species, these OH, what are called hydroxyl radicals. So that's, you can write that down, they're hydroxyl radicals. Those are very reactive. So once they form, the rest of the steps go very quick. So step 2, that's the first step. You would have to be given these steps, by the way. There's no way you would look at this and go, how did you figure that out? Well, these are actually experimental data that determine these steps, some really interesting experiments that are able to analyze chemical reactions on a very small time scale, even down to femtoseconds, which is unbelievable. Okay, so that's step 1. Step 2. One of those free radicals basically reacts with the other H2O2. Remember what the balanced chemical equation is. It's 2 H2O2, forming 2 waters and 1 oxygen. So we have to account for 2 H2O2s. So what happens there is the next one in line. So one of them's already reacted, it's split in half. Well, the next one is still there. So it's not the same one as step 1, it's another one. Well, that reacts with, because now these hydroxyl radicals are looking for something to do. You may have heard of the phrase free radicals when it comes to nutrition, and when you don't want free radicals in your body because they can destroy cells and oftentimes lead to cancers, but we won't get into that too much with this class. So what happens here is this free radical pulls off that hydrogen atom, in a sense. But they have to collide. It doesn't just reach over through midair, if you will, and pull it off magnetically. It has to physically collide with it in order to happen. The first step isn't a collision. It's just a reaction. It's a bond that splits. So what happens, what's left over is another type of free radical. I'm not sure there's a name for this one. It's not hydroxyl. And then the free radical is now something nice and stable, water. Okay, so now you've got, that's step 2. So we've formed one of our waters. We have to form another water, and we haven't formed any oxygen gas, but we have used both of our hydrogen peroxides from the original balanced equation. And, well, what do you think is going to react next? Well, okay, we don't want to make this too complicated, but we have to want to think about it a little bit, not just memorize things. So we got this free radical hanging out, and we have this free radical hanging out. Both are very reactive. Well, that's the last step. That is the last step. So the third step is those 2 highly reactive free radicals, then that are reactants in step 1 and 2, or excuse me, are products in steps 1 and 2, are now reactants in step 3. So I'm just going to bring them down here. So there's the one from step 2 and the free radical from step 1. And what do? Well, what ends up happening here is kind of what happened in step 2. Another water molecule forms. So this smaller hydroxyl radical collides with, I was going to say pulls off, that is not a great phrase, collides with the first radical and forms water. Well, guess what happens? This is left behind. That becomes oxygen gas, or oxygen. I'm going to rewrite that. Okay, so we can do this as a shorthand. I think it's important to go through and explain on a molecular level because it makes sense and it's something you can understand because you understand electron dot structures and understand chemical reactions. And the collateral use of H2O2 is just a joke. Oh, whoops. Yeah, you can ignore that. I'm going to make a graph of that later. Is transition states and activation energy. I'm going to make a graph for that later. You can ignore that. And there's just a bad joke. I'm a little older than you are, so you may not even know who that guy is. He's on TV a lot. His name's Guy Fieri, and he's always talking about how he uses peroxide on his hair. Okay, anyway, that's just a bad joke. All right, blank slide. So here's a shorthand for the mechanism, which is the way most books do it. I don't know why they don't do what I just did. Maybe they do. I don't know. I don't think your book goes into that much detail, but your book does this because, again, I stole this example from your book. Decomposition of hydrogen peroxide. So 1, 2, 3, and this is a shorthand. The way they will typically write it is H2O2 forms 2 OHs, and that's the slow step. So in other words, that's the rate determining step. And some of the homework problems give you a mechanism. They just give it to you. They don't go through and ask you to explain everything like we just did, but I don't like you just to have things without explanation wherever possible. So that's slow, and that's your rate determining step. The second step then is H2O2, the next H2O2, not the same as first step, reacts with one of those hydroxyl radicals to produce our first water molecule, and then a different type of radical, which we could write like that, HO2. It just looks a little weird because it's not H2O, but go back and look. And that's fast. Makes sense because hydroxyl radicals are unstable, so this is a very quick reaction once it gets going. Okay, the last step is the remaining, well, I think I'm going to write it the way your book does, I'm pretty sure. So that radical that formed in step 2 reacts with the remaining hydroxyl radical from step 1 to give another water and oxygen gas. And then this is really exactly like Hess's law. If you add all this stuff together, I'm not sure I want to scratch it out in your notes, but maybe it'll be helpful. Let me get another color here. So there's an OH, and an OH will cancel those OHs. They're on opposite sides of the arrow. The HO2 will cancel the HO2. I guess it's also kind of like redox, isn't it? Where you have to cancel things on both sides when you add them together. It's not the same, of course. But if you add all this stuff up together, you will get our balanced chemical equation, which you have to. I mean, it has to end up being this. So one thing I like about this is when we write chemical equations, we don't really think about how we go from point A to point B. It's just reactants and products. And for most of what we do in chemistry, that's fine. But it is important to know how does it get there. Okay, so before I'm going to show you, now the last thing is a big picture, so we'll almost need a whole page in your notes for it, but I'll sneak in a definition here. So the radicals, they don't appear in the overall chemical equation, but they're very important. These are called intermediates. I don't think that's a confusing word at all. That makes sense. Sometimes our words, especially when they're derived from other languages, we have to think about a little bit. That's okay. The universal language of science and math. And this one, in this case, makes complete sense. Okay, what I'd like to do next is to show you an energy diagram for this reaction. Is how can we think about, so the first step is the slow step. That one requires the highest activation energy. That's the biggest thermodynamic barrier. The second steps, the thermodynamic barriers, are much, much lower. And this is something that the end of the chapter has, but I like doing this at the beginning because then we're going to get into a bunch of mathematical algorithms for how do you handle kinetic data. So we'll come back to all this theory a little bit later, but let's get this right now. So this is that step of transition states and, and activation energy from that before. So you're going to want a nice big open space on this one, like a whole page, or even turn your paper to the side, or just watch me do it and then copy it down when I'm done. So since it's a graph, this is H2O2 decomposition. And this is a theoretical graph, by the way. This is not data you would go into the lab and collect. This would be computational data. So this is merely conceptual. Well, it's still important. It's not merely. And big graph. Hopefully I have enough space to do this. So what we're doing on the y-axis is we're graphing potential energy in the form of bond energy, because we're going to be making and breaking bonds. And on the x-axis, we're starting off by looking at the reactants. If you want to write out reactants, that's fine. Ending up with the products. There's different ways for this. So we're going to sort of do a Gedanken experiment, as it's called, a thought experiment. Gedanken is German for that. And these graphs are often called, well, this is the extent of reaction. And an unnecessarily complex name is given to it, but it kind of makes sense. This is called the reaction coordinate. That's not hugely important. What we're doing is we're taking the concepts that we did before, elementary steps, and showing it what's happening energetically. So, first things first, I'm going to try to make this look reasonably neat. The potential energy of the reactants, let's just put those, I'm going to need some space. So I'm just going to put them somewhat arbitrarily here. It's not completely arbitrary. So we have two reactants to get started, two H2O2s. Now the products, for a chemical reaction to occur without intervention, the potential energy of the products is going to be less than the potential energy of the reactants. Okay, so what do we end up with? Well, we end up with two waters and oxygen. So that's kind of the big picture here. And I don't think I put very much of a gap in between. So what we have to do is we're going to take those three steps. We have to overcome these thermodynamic barriers. So we're going to have, in this case, there's 3 steps, 3 thermodynamic barriers. And I kind of want to show you how this works. It's almost like a video version of what we did, those static 3 steps. Maybe it's a good way of thinking about it. So the first step in the reaction is that bond in H2O2 has to break. So we know that's going to be our biggest thermodynamic barrier. So I'm going to write that way up here, and then it will come down. So what's going on here? Well, let's see if I can do this neatly. So we have this bond breaking in H2O2. And most books say, okay, so right at the breaking point, and we'll just put a dashed line here. That's the point where the potential energy is the highest. So that little dashed line in between there is indicating that the bond is just about to break. That is called, I don't think I'm going to have space. Well, maybe I will. That's called a transition, state, and is given this symbol. So it's right before, well, it breaks apart. That's called a transition state. Okay, well so then this comes down, then that first step is done. And maybe we can label those. So that's step 1. Then the next step is going to be lower in activation energy. And I think the last one, let me get the humps in here so it looks reasonable, and then we'll label everything. And then the last one is slightly lower in energy. I forget where I got this graph. I don't know if I got this from your book or not. That's really sloppy looking. Try to make those a little bit more, I don't know, aesthetically pleasing in your notes. So this is step 2, step 3. Every step has a transition state. So this first step, the transition state, is a bond breaking. The second step, I'm going to see if I can make this a little smaller. There's the transition state. That's a bond forming because you're making water in this case. So this second step, first step is bond breaking, second step is bond forming, and that's your transition state. So you have transition state 1, transition state 2, and then of course you'll have transition state 3 here. And the last step is another bond forming between that leftover radical and the leftover hydroxyl radical. And I'm not drawing that really very well. Actually, we have lots of bonds forming there. We have H2O2 forming and O2 forming. So that's really all I want you to take away there, is this is a different representation of the mechanism. Some really important things here are, where do we put activation energy? It's an energy, and this is the highest energy. So this, what we're going to do, and I'll just kind of put this, so that there's our baseline. That's where the potential energy starts. Activation energy is this. And it's the biggest for step 1. So we have EA1, and then EA2 and EA3 are smaller, which for kinetics means fast. Oh, the other thing I can label here is something we've discussed before, is the decomposition of H2O2 is exothermic, so it's a negative enthalpy. And that's because the potential energy of the products is less than the potential energy of the reactants. And we may have done this with the graph last semester. If you take the potential energy where you end and the potential energy where you begin, well, that's the delta H. Just to tie it in with another concept. And in this case, it's going to be negative or exothermic. So the potential energy of the products, which is less, minus the potential energy of the reactants, which is more, that of course gives you a negative number, which you interpret as exothermic. And I think that's it. So that is our overview of chemical kinetics. So the first video is more practical. How do you actually get data and put numbers on things? And the second one was a little bit more theoretical in terms of collisions, reaction mechanisms, transition states, all that kind of stuff. So our goals for the next few lectures are to take all that and unpack it into some practical considerations, where we'll also use Microsoft or whatever spreadsheet program you use, Excel, or whatever Apple product you use. So it'll be made actually pretty straightforward. So there's all the theory, and we are done.